Well, as we get started tonight, any questions from finishing out Luke or starting John? No questions? All right. Well, let's get started with the Gospel of John. And I kind of got into a little bit of this morning, and so I won't duplicate a lot of what I said this morning. But John is very different. John was written, as I mentioned this morning, John is it's the only gospel that was written after the temple was destroyed. And John is one of only 2 books in the New Testament that was written after the temple was destroyed. This morning, did you understand what I was saying when I said that greatly affects how John would write his gospel, knowing that the temple is gone? Does that make sense? If I were to write you a letter today, and then if I were to write you a letter 10 years from now, if this church were torn down in that time period, that letter would come across very differently. I would have to address different things based on the church being torn down. That sets a very different tone. So understanding that, and quite honestly, that just hit me this week as I was researching my sermon. I hadn't even connected the fact that John was writing this gospel after the temple was destroyed, but that has a major effect on how he writes. And the reason that jumped out at me is recognizing why John put the clearing of the temple story at the beginning rather than at the end. But he was trying to tell people up front, the temple is not necessary. Now, all the other gospel writers said the same thing. All 4 gospels have this account of Jesus clearing out the temple. But they said it at the end, and John sets the stage by putting it at the beginning.
Are you saying the 2 clearings of the temple, are you saying there's only one versus, the way I read it, there was one at the beginning of his ministry where that happened, and it happened again at the end of his ministry. So were there 2 different ones, or are you saying there's one?
John does not give an account at the end.
But he
only gives one account. Yeah.
No, not just John, but...
I think that John just moved the order around.
Oh, okay.
I think there was only one. And part of that, if there were 2, then I think that they would have mentioned it twice. Because if it's significant enough for everybody to mention, then if there were 2, the reason that they put it that way, a lot of people, when you try to read the Gospel of John in chronological order, then it makes it look like, well, there had to have been 2. And there's a lot of opinions on that. But if you recognize the significance of the temple being torn down, that's why John would mention this story at the beginning. Then all of a sudden it would make sense. Okay, he's just trying to set the tone at the beginning. Because in John's writing, whereas John writes very different from the others, even in what we read this morning, he mentioned when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this. And there was another place... Seems like there was another place that I had read this morning where it kind of mentioned that concept of he's writing this gospel post-resurrection, and he makes that very clear from the very beginning that all this took place, or we understood this after he died. So he doesn't necessarily set out to write a chronological approach. The problem is, and the reason that a lot of scholars think there were 2 clearing of the temples, is because they're trying to make John chronological. Because they're trying to make it make sense. And since he put that at the beginning, then it must have been twice. But if you look at John and say, okay, John wasn't trying to write a chronological story, then it would make sense that there was just one time. But John mentioned it first because he wanted to set the tone because the temple had been destroyed.
Do any of the other Gospels talk about it twice?
No.
Okay.
No, the other Gospels only mention it once in Holy Week.
And I have one other question regarding when he made the comment, I can destroy this temple in 3 days. And from the commentaries I read, they thought that he was talking about he would rise after he'd been crucified. He was talking about his body, that he would rise in 3 days.
Mm-hmm. And that's what John actually says here. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples, remember, he had said this. When Jesus said his temple, he meant his own body. So yeah, he was definitely referring to his own body and the 3 days. And that made sense to the disciples post-resurrection.
But then you're kind of carrying it a different direction, and that he's talking, when you talked about the destruction of the temple, that he outlived it. He was the only one that lived past the destruction. So you're just kind of carrying it in a different direction.
Right.
How it affected him.
Right. What I'm saying, when I say that the temple was destroyed, as far as we can tell, John is the only apostle that lived long enough to see the temple destroyed. All of the other apostles were killed. Some were killed as early as, we believe, 36 AD. It was when we believe that James was killed, somewhere in that time period. Peter and Paul were all killed in 64, 65. And in between there, all the other apostles were martyred. All the other apostles were killed for their faith. So John was the only one who lived long enough to see the destruction of the temple. And the reason that that's so important is because in that culture, all religions were driven by a temple. Every god had a temple. And the reason that the Romans had such a problem with the Jewish God was not that they had a God, but was that they believed that there was only one God, whereas the Romans believed in many gods. And depending on which city you were in, that was your favorite god. And we'll talk about this when we go through the letters. Each city that Paul writes to had their own god, and that plays into the letter. We'll see hints of that.
The Samaritans, they had their own temple.
The Samaritans had built their own temple because they weren't allowed in the temple in Jerusalem because they were half-breeds. So they said, fine, we'll build our own temple. And they worshiped very differently. It was the same God, but it wasn't the same temple. So that was the argument that the Samaritan woman tried to start with Jesus, and Jesus didn't take the bait and argue about it. He just said, time's coming, you won't be able to argue either place, or worship either place. So I wasn't saying that it was the temple that was going to be destroyed here. It's clear that the passage says that it was his body that he was referring to. But it's significant that the temple actually was destroyed. Not that Jesus rebuilt it in 3 days, because he didn't, but that John was the only one who lived to see that. And he writes from that perspective, which, again, like I said, if this church building were torn down, if all churches were torn down, that's going to change the way that I write a letter to the church versus writing a letter when the church is going well. Does that make sense? Okay. So this, the Gospel of John is very different. It is the only non-synoptic gospel. It's written from a very different perspective. But yet it communicates a lot of the same truth in a different way. Excuse me. Authorship. There's a lot of evidence within John, and I alluded to some of this morning. John doesn't refer to himself by name, and neither did Matthew. If you remember back to Matthew, the evidence that we tracked down to confirm that it was Matthew is the attention that he gives to tax collectors. The fact that in Matthew, it is the only gospel where he calls himself Matthew in the list of the 12 disciples. Mark and Luke give the name Levi. Yeah, they give a different name. Matthew is the only one that uses his given name. We track that down. There's internal evidence to tell us who the author is. Luke doesn't identify himself, but he identifies in his gospel, he identifies that it's written to Theophilus. In the book of Acts, he'll identify that it's written to Theophilus. And then, starting in chapter 16 of Acts, he starts to say we. Instead of he, it was we. And we went here, and we did this, and we did this. And when you look over to some of Paul's letters, he'll say, only Luke is here with me. In one of those sections where it's a we went here, and we went here. So you kind of track down the evidence to find out who these guys are, because they didn't sign them. They didn't need to. The people that they sent them to knew exactly who they were. In this gospel, there's a lot of internal evidence to tell us who John is. We know that the author was an apostle. He tells us that it was an eyewitness. We know that he was one of the 12. And he refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. When he's talking about the Last Supper, he says, the disciple who was leaning on Jesus' breast. At the end, when he's talking to Peter, or talking about Peter and what kind of death he would die, Peter turned around and saw behind him the disciple that Jesus loved. And Peter asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus says, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? Keep your nose out of it. I'm not telling you his story. So he refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. That's internal evidence, and we can kind of narrow down, okay, which one isn't mentioned when he says that, and kind of track it down to John. So we believe that this is John, the son of Zebedee. He was one of the sons of thunder. External evidence for the authorship of John, from the 2nd century on, very strong. Everybody agrees that this is written by John the Apostle, John the son of Zebedee. So we see a lot of evidence everywhere. People argue about whether Matthew wrote Matthew, but nobody argues whether John wrote John. Everybody agrees that it was clearly written by the Apostle John. So who was John? When we first see John, he was a fisherman. He was the younger brother of James, and together they were the sons of thunder. I joked about this before. I believe Peter, James, and John were all three very dynamic men. And I believe, I joke about this, but I believe that there's a little bit of truth to the fact that Jesus couldn't leave these three alone, or they'd get into a whole lot of trouble. So they're called sons of thunder, and when he gives them that nickname, that tells us a little bit about their personality. He is the son of Zebedee. His father was in charge of their fishing business, and James and John left their father in the boat and got up and followed Jesus. They were friends of Peter and possibly partners with Peter. We believe that he came from the same village as Peter and Andrew. They all four came from Bethsaida, is what the external evidence points to. So he was a fisherman. James and John, Peter and Andrew were all fishermen. He was also an apostle. The beloved apostle is how he refers to himself. He was a part of the inner circle, so he has access to information that Matthew would not have had access to, because he went more places with Jesus than Matthew went with Jesus. He was one of the true disciples mentioned as being at the trial of Jesus. This is going to be very significant when we get to the trial, because Matthew and Mark and Luke don't give a lot of information about the trial. John gives a lot more extensive information about the trial of Jesus. We're going to see the ins and the outs. Jesus went here inside, then he went outside. Then he went inside, then he went outside. We're going to see a lot more information about the trial of Jesus because John was there. And he had access. He was friends of the high priest. He had access to the inner courts, whereas Peter stayed in the outer courts where he was warming himself by the fire and denying Jesus. So the first-hand experience of the trial, John's the only one that was there, the only one of the disciples who was there to have that access. And he was the only apostle listed as being present at the crucifixion. We don't know if other disciples were there or not. But we know that John was there. So that also is significant. He's going to have details that the others might not have access to. Interestingly, he was given charge of Mary while Jesus was on the cross. There are some who believe that Jesus may have been a cousin to John. That some people believe that Mary, that his mother may have been a sister or a cousin or somehow related to Mary, the mother of Jesus, to signify why Jesus would put John in charge of his mother. Typically, that's something that would be done by siblings. I mean, and Jesus had brothers. We knew that. Jesus' brothers would also die for their faith. It could be that Jesus knew that John was going to live the longest and be the only one of the disciples who would live as long as his mother. And he knew that his brothers would also die at death. We don't know, but it's interesting to think about the fact that John was given charge of Mary, and he said, "Woman, this is your son. Man, this is your mother," on the cross. And this isn't in the scriptures. This is the outside evidence, the outside references to John. We call him John the Indestructible. He lived to be the oldest disciple. He's the only disciple to die a natural death, but it wasn't because they didn't try to kill him. The legends tell us that John was trying to reach a robber, and he had a heart for this guy, and he couldn't communicate well. He couldn't get a hold of the guy. So he allowed himself to be captured by robbers. He intentionally went down a road where he knew he would be captured by the robbers so that he could preach to one of these guys. And, we hear about Paul and the sacrifices that Paul went through. You can see a lot of these stories, and they're not in Scripture as clearly as Paul's are, but the legends that surround the other books that were written around that time, the early church fathers wrote about John, that he was very passionate and he would go to all ends to reach people for God. He took time to relax. It was quoted that he had said in extra biblical literature, "The bow that is always bent will soon cease to shoot straight." He recognized the need to relax, and in the early church fathers, they wrote that John was very adamant that you've got to take time to relax. John was pastor at Ephesus after Paul. He was, and this is the early church fathers that tell us where he was at. And this is why in the book of Revelation, he references the 7 churches when Jesus is talking to John, and they all kind of center around that area of Asia where John would have been the pastor at Ephesus. So churches that John would have known well. There were several attempts to kill him, as the legends tell us. They tried throwing him to the lions, and the lions would not eat him. They tried burning him at the stake, and he would not burn. They tried boiling him in oil, and he would not boil. and if you can imagine this, according to the stories that are written, he sat there for the longest time and finally just said, "This doesn't seem to be going anywhere. You mind if I get out?" And this is all in the early church fathers. There's a possibility that some of this may not be true. There's a pretty good evidence that a lot of it is true. We don't know, but we know that he was the only apostle to die a natural death, and that he was, they would have tried to kill him. They definitely tried, and he didn't die. So, John the Indestructible. We also see some reference to this on his behalf in John chapter 21. Verse 22, it says, "Jesus replied, 'If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me.' So the rumor spread among the community of believers that this disciple wouldn't die. But this isn't what Jesus said at all. He only said, 'If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?'" So he's addressing the rumors that are circulating. Because at this point, the rumors are circulating that John's just never going to die. But we know that Jesus is going to come back before John does die. And John is saying, that's not what Jesus said. He just told Peter it was none of his business whether I died or not, or how I died, how I was going to die. But that rumor was fueled by the fact, well, they tried to feed him to the lions, well, they tried to burn him at the stake, they tried to throw him in boiling oil. So that fed this rumor that John addresses at the end of his gospel. He was exiled to the island of Patmos. After they couldn't kill him, they finally said, well, we're not going to let you be around people. So they exiled him to the island of Patmos, which is where he received the revelation in the book of Revelation. So he starts out that book by saying, when I was exiled to the island of Patmos. The church historians tell us that he returned to Ephesus to die peacefully after 100 years of age. He was an old man when he died. To reach 100, especially with everything that he had gone through, quite a Quite a deal. Would have been fun to preach that funeral, wouldn't it? All right, so the date. When was this gospel written? And we don't know specifically when it was written, but somewhere between the years of 70 and 100 AD. Again, the other gospels were written between 50 and 60 AD, but all the other gospels were written prior to the collapse of the Jewish nation, the collapse of Israel. And we believe, based on the information that they received and what they allude to, that they were clearly written earlier. And this date being written this late is again very significant, because he's writing to a different church, to a church. He's also writing to second and third generation Christians at this point in time. There's not many people left in our church who were around. There's nobody left in our church who were around in 1908 when the Nazarene Church was formed. And even within our local church here in Davenport, there's no one left who was a part of this church when it originally founded in 1932. There's a difference in how people acted at being a part of the Nazarene Church in the 1930s than people who came into the church later. Now, Bob, your in-laws came into the church in the 50s, 1955, I think is what they've told me. So they've been around for a lot of the history. They've been around longer than anybody else has, but they still weren't around in those early years. So they would have been second generation. When you look at this, people change, things change in multiple generations. And if you can imagine how Christianity has changed from the first generation Christians, which is where the first three Gospels were written to the second and third generation, so your children have a different understanding of the church than what your Judy's parents have, because they've been around the church longer. A lot has transpired in the church in the last 50, 60 years. A lot has taken place in the Nazarene Church. Your in-laws came into the church at a very legalistic time period in the church history. Legalism was absolutely rampant in the 50s. And Linda, I know you were in the Bettendorf church at that time period. Legalism was huge, especially on the Iowa district. Iowa was known as one of the most legalistic districts. And so when you look at how different the church is 2 or 3 generations later, if the people who were in charge of the church in the 60s were to come back today, they would have a fit about the fact that I'm not up there and that I don't have a tie on. I don't wear a white shirt very often. I know, Bob, your father-in-law comments every time I wear a white shirt, "You look sharp today." He never says that when I'm wearing a colored shirt. His generation believes a pastor needs to wear a white shirt and a tie. And to me, I just don't even think about it. It took me a long time to recognize, because every time I wore a white shirt, he would comment. And he didn't any other week. And finally it dawned on me, that's right, he always wears a white shirt and a jacket. And that's what he's commenting. He wishes I would wear a white shirt more often. Now, he won't tell me that, but he'll comment when I do it right. He'll let me know he thinks I'm doing it right. But there's a huge difference, first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation. And what John is writing to address in this gospel is those second, third generation problems that arose in the church, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written to address the first generation problems. First generation problems, they were just wanting to know, what were the facts? How did it happen? What can you verify? Luke says, I want to give an orderly account so that you can know with assurance what you have been taught. But with John, there's a whole new set of problems that have arisen in the church that John is writing to address. And so the date of this is very significant. And it's important for us to understand that this was written later, and here's how we can tell that, and here's what that was written to address. Some of the internal evidence that we see too, in chapter 6, verse 1, and also in chapter 21, when John references the Sea of Galilee, he doesn't call it the Sea of Galilee. He calls it the Sea of Tiberias. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke call it the Sea of Galilee. Part of the conquering of Israel was that they changed it from the Sea of Galilee to the Sea of Tiberias. That name change happened after Jerusalem was destroyed. So when John is writing his letter, He's referencing it by what it goes by now, not by what it went by then. So again, that tells us it's the same sea, just in case you're wondering. When we get to chapter 6 this week, you'll see the Sea of Tiberias. You'll know. It's the Sea of Galilee. But that name change happened afterwards. I'm guessing that there's some street names that have changed here in Davenport over time. And I don't know what they are, but most of you would know of it. Yeah, that used to be whatever street, and now they've changed it to Martin Luther King Avenue of the Cities. The John Baker Bridge, I mean, that hasn't always been the John Baker Bridge. It was the 280 Bridge, I'm guessing, is what they called it before. Those name changes happen, and we just adjust to them. We go on. But this evidence shows us again that this happened after the destruction of the temple. He references Peter's martyrdom in what I had read to you there at the end. Right before that, he talks to Peter and tells Peter that he'll die a painful death. This will, people are going to tie you up and lead you. Peter's martyrdom took place in AD 65, which was right before the temple was destroyed in AD 70. But he references that. So it was clearly after Peter's death that John was writing. He does not reference the Sadducees, because the Sadducees as a political party disappeared after AD 70. You remember the Pharisees were a group of people who were really legalistic. They wanted to make sure that all the laws were being upheld. The Sadducees were the political brown-nosers. They wanted enough of the law to still be Jews, but they wanted enough of the Greek culture to get the approval of and get away with whatever they wanted from the Romans. Well, after the Romans clamped down on them, there was no such party, because nobody wanted to be associated with the Romans anymore because of how cruel they were. So the Sadducees disappeared as a political party. John doesn't reference the Sadducees because nobody would know who they were. These generations that he's writing to would not know who they were because they didn't exist anymore. So there's some of the internal evidence that shows us that this was clearly written after the year AD 70. Where was it written? It was written to be in Ephesus, is where we believed that this book was written, where John served as a pastor. So it was not written from Jerusalem, it was written from Ephesus. Because nobody wanted to be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was gone. I mean, it was just desolated. All right, the audience. Who was this gospel written to? Who was Matthew written to? Mostly a Jewish audience. Who was Mark written to? You remember? Mark was written to a mostly Gentile audience. He explains, in Mark, he explains the Aramaic or the Jewish terms. He will say it, and then he'll translate or explain what that word means in the Greek. Luke was written to who? Theophilus, who was a Gentile. Luke also was a Gentile. John is written both to Jews and Gentiles. But Jews and Gentiles who are not living in Jerusalem. But Jews and Gentiles who are living all over the known Roman world at that time. Here's some areas where we can tell that it was written to the Jews. In his letter, he clearly demonstrates that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the Jewish Messiah. Shows him to be the fulfillment of many Old Testament themes. So he'll say this fulfills the prophecy. Not as much as Matthew, but he does it a couple of times. Shows Jesus to be the Son of the God. And we read this, I don't know exactly where you focused this morning, Jerry. But in the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God, and God created everything through him. Nothing was created except through him. And the Word gave life to everything that was created. And his life brought light to everyone. So he definitely alludes to the Jews, this is the Son of the God. He was there in the beginning. When the world was created, Jesus was there. The Word existed. So there's definitely an area where we can see him going to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. He explains Jewish customs. He explains Palestinian geography. So when he's referring to places, he'll say, this was here. It's clear that it was written to people who don't know the geography of Palestine. Translates the Aramaic into Greek. Mark did this as well, but he'll give a word and then he'll refer to this is what it means. Jesus is the Word made flesh was opposing Stoicism and Gnosticism. In verse 14, so the Word became human and made his home among us. Or the Message tells us, and I love the way the Message paraphrases this, he became flesh, or he moved into the neighborhood. The Word, or God, moved into the neighborhood. Now, Stoicism and Gnosticism were two of the second and third generation problems that developed in the church. They didn't even exist in the area when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing their Gospels. These were end of the New Testament problems. Gnosticism was a belief that anything that was made up of matter was evil. It's an evil pew because it's made up of matter. My body is evil because it's made up of matter. Now, we believe that we are evil. We believe that we have the propensity to sin, that we are basically bad. But we don't believe that we're completely evil. Here's the problem that Gnosticism brought about. Gnostics would say, since my body is evil, might as well do whatever I want, because it's evil anyway. The only thing that matters is my spirit, because my spirit isn't evil. So I can go out and engage in whatever kinds of sin I want to with my body. I just have to keep my spirit clear. You can't do that, in case you're wondering. The spirit and the body are one. I mean, they're distinct, but they're one. If I take my body out and engage in sin, my spirit went with it. The Gnostics would say that you can separate the two. Your body can engage in sin, that's what it has to do, but you don't, your spirit doesn't have to. The problem with that, one of the problems with that too, is that the Gnostics said that Jesus could not have been human. If all matter is evil, if our bodies are evil, then Jesus could not have been a human. Because if Jesus was a human, then he would not have been able to be God. He would have had to have only been one or the other. Because, and the problem with that comes in, if Jesus wasn't really human, he didn't really die on the cross. And if he didn't really die on the cross, we can't be forgiven. Now, what's Stoicism? Ever been called stoic? Bob Potter, I'm sure you've been called stoic a lot, haven't you? No. Stoics were a group of people who took a very negative view of life, very somber, very serious, and everything was negative. They deprived themselves of all luxuries, and they just, anything that was pleasure was sin. The Nazarene Church kind of went this way in the 50s and 60s too. So he also was writing to say, it's okay to have fun. Jesus had fun too. Jesus laughed. Jesus was fully human. He had a good time with his disciples. So this mindset, this concept was opposed, and that's a part of what he's writing to address. So what was the purpose of this gospel? The purpose of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were to communicate the basics of the faith to different audiences. The purpose of John is not so much to communicate the basics, because when John writes this gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are already in circulation. Those gospels are already out there. They cover that. He knows that the basics are covered because he knows that these gospels are out there. He probably reads them too and remembers. But he writes his gospel to be different from theirs. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written about the same time period. And they were written distinctly enough that they were going to certain audiences. John was written to go to all of the churches, the Jews and to the Gentiles, second, third generations, but he was writing to a much broader audience at a much different time period. In John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, he gives us his purpose. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe not so that you can believe with certainty the things that which you have been taught, but that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life by the power of his name. He lays it out there pretty clear to us, doesn't it? But he also alludes to in that, not, whereas Luke says, I want you to be able to believe with certainty what you have heard, John is saying, I want you to continue believing. You've been believing. Your parents believed. I want you to be able to continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. In the ESV Study Bible, it says this, and I wanted to point this out because I think this is good. His depth of teaching shows that he wanted readers not only to come to initial saving faith in Jesus, but also to grow into a rich, well-informed faith. John's central contention is that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah and Son of God, and that by believing in him, people may have eternal life. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written early on, they were just trying to convince people that who Jesus was. John was trying to tell them, and I kind of alluded to this morning, John was trying to tell them, it's not just believing in him and getting saved, but it's the relationship with him, it's the life that you live with him that matters. It's not just a one-time belief. It is a lifelong learning and growing and becoming who you're supposed to become. So the character of the Gospel of John. It's the gospel of love. Love is mentioned 44 times in John's Gospel compared to 14 in Luke and even fewer than that in Matthew and Mark. Love is going to be a big theme that we'll see. John tells the beginning of Jesus' ministry that was left out by the other three, and more specifically, of the last night of Jesus' life. Did you notice when we read this week what Jesus, or what John had to say about John the Baptist? John the Baptist's teaching. Again, John the Baptist, as I mentioned this morning, was a disciple of John, or John the Apostle was a disciple of John the Baptist before he started following Jesus. If you turn to chapter 1, the following day, John the Baptist was again, this is verse 35, was again standing with two of his disciples. As Jesus walked by, John looked at him and declared, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." When John's two disciples heard this, they followed Jesus. Jesus turned around and saw them following and said, "What do you want?" They replied, "Rabbi," which means teacher, and again he's explaining this to a Gentile audience. Rabbi is the Jewish term or Aramaic term. He's explaining to his readers, this means teacher. "Where are you staying? Come and see," he said. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they went with him to the place where he was staying, and they remained with him the rest of the day. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of these men who heard what John said and then followed Jesus. This is why we believe that, part of why we believe that Andrew and Peter may have been in partnership with James and John. Because Andrew and John had both left their father's businesses, or the business, to go and be with Jesus. Or with John the Baptist. And then they would go back and work on the boats, and they would come back and spend time with John the Baptist. They went back to work on the boats, and then when Jesus comes walking by the Sea of Galilee and says, "Come follow me," you see, John has already had some communication, and Andrew has already had communication with Jesus. They've already followed him and spent an afternoon with him. So when Jesus is walking by the sea and sees them in their father's boats, and he says, "Come follow me," they know who he is. They may not know fully who he is, but they know who he is. They've had some conversation with him. So that detail is mentioned. Nobody else mentions that because nobody else was there as a disciple of John the Baptist. Also on the last night, John is going to give a whole lot more detail of the last night, of the time in the garden, the time in the upper room. Actually, the upper room is where he really focuses. It's really interesting that as much time as John spends in the upper room, writing about the upper room, he does not give the specifics of the Lord's Supper. It's the only gospel that doesn't. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give this wine is my blood and this bread is my body. John doesn't do that. Some people have taken that to mean, well, then the other three exaggerated. No, John knew that was already out there. He didn't need to retell that story. He was telling a different details of the story. because the other guys had covered that adequately. He didn't need to tell that. But the other guys didn't mention Jesus getting down and washing their feet. And he wanted that story to be out there. The other guys didn't mention the story of the vine. And John wanted that to be out there. So understand as you read this, you're going to be, well, he left something out. Well, yeah, because that was already out there. He's trying to fill in the blanks, not trying to rewrite the story. What are you doing, Jeff? The humanity of Jesus. Again, John is going to tell us more about Jesus' humanity because he's trying to counter the concept of Gnosticism that Jesus wasn't truly human. That didn't exist when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing. But he also emphasizes the deity of Jesus. He wants to make sure that people knew he was God. He was fully God and fully human. It's hard for us to understand. It was hard for them to understand. And the Stoics believed that Jesus was fully God, but not human. Or the Gnostics believed that Jesus was fully God, but not fully human. The Stoics believed that Jesus was fully human. He was just a good teacher, but he wasn't fully God. So he's counteracting those by saying, no, he was fully both God and fully human. Again, we've already said this. It's very different from the other Gospels. There's no account of the birth of Jesus. There's no account of Jesus' baptism, which would have been really interesting to hear from John's perspective because he was probably there at the baptism, whereas the others weren't. Have you thought about that? John, he was a disciple of John the Baptist. When Jesus comes to John to be baptized, man, it would have been a whole lot more informative to hear that story from somebody who was standing right there, but he figured that the story was already out there. He didn't need to put it in there. There's no account of Jesus' temptations. There's nothing of the Last Supper. Again, he spends chapters on that night, but leaves out the Last Supper because it had already been covered. He doesn't mention Gethsemane specifically by name, whereas the others do. Doesn't say anything about Jesus' ascension. And no word of the healings of the demon-possessed. So there's distinctives. There's ways that he's very different from the other three Gospels. But again, he's trying to tell a different story to a much different audience. John doesn't give any parables. Isn't that interesting? We've read a lot of parables, haven't we? Not going to read any more parables. Not for a year. All right. Questions about John?
When you were talking about his evil, because when my question was, did God ever create evil?
That's a very good question. Did he?
No, he didn't.
No, he didn't. He created free will, which allows for evil, but he didn't create evil. But the Gnostics were not fully God believers. They were drawing from a whole lot of gods and religions and kind of piecing together what they wanted to believe. And truthfully, that's what people in our culture do too. We pull from a whole lot of different trains of thought. There are Christians who tell me that they believe in reincarnation. Oh, really? Where's that in the Bible? We pull together the bits and pieces that we want, that we like, from a lot of different religions and say, oh, well, it all comes together. No. This is it. If it's not here, it ain't so. We've got to understand that there is truth. We can't just do an a la carte version of Christianity. Any other questions about John?
You think the plan was to have him live that long so he could write Revelation?
Could have been. I mean, nobody else would have. To me, the most meaningful part of the book of Revelation is the letters to the churches. And you had to have lived long enough for those things to take place in the churches in order for those letters to be written. You know, in the year 65, Jesus wouldn't tell the church in Ephesus that they were lukewarm, or the church in Sardis that they were lukewarm, or He wouldn't have had to because they were still on fire. But do we as Christians need to know what Jesus thinks of what it is to be lukewarm? Absolutely. We need to know that he finds that repulsive and spews us out of his mouth. So it's very possible that Jesus allowed him to live so that he could write down the book of Revelation.
It's also a big encouragement to know what's going on in heaven.
Yes.
As he saw it.
Yeah, it really is. And when he writes the book of Revelation, he's writing to tell us, in the end, God wins. You may not understand how it's going to go down. We don't understand how it's going to go down. But in the end, God wins. And we can't even imagine what it's like there. We can't even imagine the splendor. Words cannot describe the splendor that John saw. So, he did live a long life, and it probably had a lot to do with that. Because if someone from that generation, if Jesus had appeared even to Timothy or Silas or somebody from multiple, they would not have had the authority that John the Apostle would have had. They never saw Jesus. They wouldn't recognize him the way that John did. And at this time, John was the authority in the church. If you had a question, ask John. Because John was the only one left. And so the letter of Revelation would have had to have come from someone with that level of apostolic authority, or else it would not have been included in Scripture. And it wouldn't have been as believable coming from somebody else. If I were to have an experience like that and write it down, you guys might believe me because you know me, but nobody else in the world would believe me because they don't know me. But from John, it's believable. Any other thoughts? Ready to read John? There's always going to be people who don't want to believe. There's always going to be people who say they don't believe in God. Because if there is a God, then we're responsible to him. And if we're responsible to him, we don't get to do what we want.
My note says that over 90% of John is unique.
Yeah. I showed you guys was it last week? Or 2 weeks ago? I showed you the harmony of the Gospels. You'll notice that it's mostly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John doesn't show up. 90% of John is unique.
But that's because he was writing to the second, third generation.
And that part was already there. He didn't need to restate the obvious. He did restate the crucifixion, but 90% of it is unique. So, after reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke and kind of feeling like we've been there, done that, we're back in new territory again. All right. Bob Blowers, why don't you close us in prayer?